Indigenous families know about children who never came home from school, who died far away in what were called residential schools. In most cases, the bodies would not be sent home unless the family paid for it. And so here we are, decades later, finding these unmarked graves, causing families to be traumatized all over again. Finding the graves is hard work, both technically and emotionally. With me is Kisha Supernant. She is director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology at the University of Alberta. Kisha, this is such sensitive work on so many levels because ground-penetrating radar involves walking over the graves. Can you help us understand the intensive, sensitive nature of the work?
Yes, it is extremely difficult work. So there's, of course, the technical elements of ensuring that we're doing all this work to the highest possible standard. But being out in these places often means hearing the stories of survivors and families, and then starting to get those traces and hints of the possible burial places of these children who never came home. It is very emotionally devastating and difficult work to do as we walk across the graves of these children.
And each community, of course, will make their own decisions about the next steps when graves are found. But can you explain what's involved if they decide to go ahead and identify the remains and give them a proper burial?
I think this is a really big and important question. So the work that we've primarily done has been remote sensing and finding the locations. To take it to the next step involves really a form of forensic investigation, and that can involve exhumation, potentially using techniques such as DNA to try to identify these children and connect them with living relatives. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes that's not. That's quite a time-intensive process if that is the next steps that a community wants to take. And then there's also a call for justice and accountability. And there are forensic approaches which can look at potential signs of any remains that of trauma or things like that. But that itself is a big unknown. We don't know what the state of the remains necessarily are. We don't know how many answers can be found. And I want to emphasize, I think a lot of communities, that might not be a step they're ready or willing to take. It might be enough to know where these locations are, to do the historical research, and then to commemorate and do ceremony around these sacred places. So we'll have to see how communities wish to approach it, but it will be a more forensic investigation should there be more work beyond the kind of ground penetrating radar.
Are there enough people in this country with the expertise and the experience to do this kind of work, even the ground-penetrating radar for all the sites that might exist?
Not in the timelines that I think many communities are hoping for. There just are a small handful of people with experience on the ground-penetrating radar side. There's not that many more that might have capacity on the forensic side. And I think there's a role potentially for private industry to play a role here, especially on the ground penetrating radar, but it has to be done to the highest technical standards. And there are some best practices that we've established. I know there's also been conversations about potentially engaging with internationals or task forces and groups who have done forensic work at the scale that might be required. So I think there's a lot to sort out about how we can actually meet the needs of communities from a capacity standpoint, and hopefully build some of that capacity within communities where appropriate.
What do you think Canadians should expect to hear about this story in the months and years ahead?
Well, I hope that there's a continued attention to these stories as they come out from every residential school in the country. And of course, communities will decide how much they want to make public the information and in which ways. But I think we can expect more Kamloops, more Cowessess, and thousands more graves of children across the lands we call Canada.
Kisha Supernant, director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.